What's up, Jordan? You got issues you disagree with?
Um, I have a quick question, real quick. I know you said you're probably going to go into it at a later time with Dr. Branson, but can you explain really quickly the difference between counting and what absolute identity versus division?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, in the ancient and medieval world, they did both, as we still do today. But in the ancient medieval world, typically they thought that you counted by division. So what that means is counting is really just taking a whole and then dividing it, right? So like, if I have on a piece of paper, so let's say I have a piece of paper and I write on one side A, and then I write on another side B. So let's say we have this piece of paper, right? This is a single unit of paper, right? It's one. If we count by identity, meaning that we just identify this with the number one, right? We have a problem when we split this because this is no longer identical. It's no longer the same object, but it actually isn't any different, right? It's just divided. But if I count by identity, I can no longer identify this object because now it's two. You see, it's not, but it's the same object as before. It's just split, right?
Yeah.
So how many? So this is one supposedly because it's one. And then now it's two, right? So I'm actually counting by division, not by identity. If I count by identity, I now have a problem with pointing out that, well, this is the same object as before. So this is why the Creed says, for example, that in the Trinity, right, and the persons are one and undivided. So they, in the ancient medieval world, typically counted by division, not by identity. So after Leibniz, people typically start counting by mathematical problems and whatnot. And so analytical philosophy and mathematics has basically made the modern world assume that you just count everything by identity, because one reason for that is that if we count abstract things, those things sometimes do have to be counted by identity, and that's because you can't have partials in something like a law of logic. So if you're going to count an abstract thing like the law of logic, you can't have half of the law of logic, right? So it has to be counted by identity. And in medieval philosophy, there's a distinction between things of first order imposition and second order imposition. Abstract objects in medieval philosophy are called objects of second order imposition. So they would be the abstract things like we're talking about where you kind of have to count by identity. Mundane things they called first order imposition, counting dogs, cows, etc. Right? Those things you count by typically by division. So it's not an either or. So the solution to the objection in terms of how this gets into, it ties into the logical problem of the Trinity that a lot of the Muslims bring up. And it rests on multiple different assumptions. One of those assumptions is that you only count by identity, and that it assumes that all things are counted in one way. So the response is multiple. One of the responses is that, well, we count different things in different ways. And so abstract objects might at times be counted by identity. Mundane things are counted by division typically. And then sometimes we might count something in both ways, right? So does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yeah, but so there's an issue that I'm thinking of. If I chopped my bed in half and I was just get a half.
Well, that's what the argument about counted by identity doesn't account for partials, right? So, for example, if you read the philosophy papers on this, there's pretty common objections to this, like if we have two and a half bagels on a table, how many bagels are there, right? And if I take one whole bagel and I split it into halves, right? I mean, this is still a bagel, right? But if I'm counting by identity, it's also not a bagel, because I called prior to that, I called this whole object, right? Let's say this is a bagel. The whole object is called a bagel. So I've identified the whole with what bagel is. But if I tear it in half, and I've got two halves. Do I not have bagel anymore because I identified bagel with the whole? You see what I'm saying? That's why counting by identity has a problem when it comes to these kinds of things. And the other examples that Dr. Branson gives are things like, well, if you think about a cloud, what is a cloud? Well, it's just a whole bunch of like a billion molecules of water in the air. Well, if I remove one molecule of water, do I still have cloud? Yes, but it's not identical, counting by identity, to the previous cloud, right? So you see how counting by identity is on the surface, it seems like that's how we count. But when you actually think about it, no, actually we don't count that way. We count by division. But some things you do have to count by identity, like abstract objects that can't be divided, like a set, or like a, I mean, technically, I know you can divide a set, but I'm saying when you're considering a set in itself, it's the whole set. Or when you consider Aristotle's categories, like a precondition for knowledge, like the laws of logic or something, right? It doesn't make sense to talk about half of a law of logic or a third of a law of logic. So some of things like that have to be counted by identity. But most things that we talk about, especially in the world, Creed says and Maximus says things like, God is divided in his indivisibility. And there he's talking about the one, the many. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's a pretty good explanation. Did you have any specific papers on
counting? Yeah, I did. Let me go
give
you the reference to that one paper. Hold on. Let me find it.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, so the paper is called Counting. We Don't Count by Identity by Dr. David Liebesman, Liebesman. M-A-N. Dr. David, We Don't Count by Identity by Liebesman.
Dr. David who?
Liebesman. See that?
It's going to be backwards for us.
Well, I'll send it to you, Nick.
All right, cool.
Liebesman, Liebesman. We do not count by identity. And you'll notice, like, he gives examples within the first 5 pages of stuff you heard me saying, like the bagels and stuff like that. So concrete things we typically count by division. Abstract things we often count by identity. But God is a unique thing because he's not exactly like abstract or concrete things, right? So maybe in the case of God, we count both ways, so to speak.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the case of Jake, it's denying the antecedent. So when he debates with Dr. Bo about God can have a son, say he is a necessary quality to be divine. When he gets asked about the attributes considered in themselves of Allah, the whole thing falls apart. So hence the LPT doesn't really work.
I appreciate it.
Welcome. Yeah, absolutely. Great questions.
So just a real question. Do you say that the Father is God by identity or by predication? And sorry, my connection's a little bit iffy right now, but
it's fine. Yeah, so the logical problem of the Trinity hinges on a lot of different assumptions. One of those assumptions is that all naming and predicates are identical. And so the LPT hinges on that. It also hinges on counting by identity, which we don't count by identity. So the Father, the word God can pick out different things. It's not a descriptor of one type of thing. So if you have a reductionist idea of what the referent to the word God is, then that whole argument hinges on that, right? So, by the way, Joshua from the 6th, you're welcome to come on. So you're in here talking smack about, oh, you're all fangirling. Dude, any one of y'all can come on and make an argument. You can have as much time as you want. And anyway, so back to the point, God is a generic term, just like the Canaanites use the word El, and the Bible calls God El, and it calls the gods of the Canaanites the El. Okay, Does the word God only refer to one thing? No, it picks out different things. In the Bible, it picks out God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the divine nature, the divine operations. It picks out angels, demons, and men. The word God can refer to all of those things. So the word God doesn't have a single reference to either nature or person, you see. It can refer to both in the Trinity.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is there is a sense in which the Father is God by identity. Would there also be a sense that the Son is God by identity then, by that logic?
Uh, we keep in mind that we don't count by identity. So we count by division, and there's no division in God.
Okay. So what would you, so if a Muslim was asking, like, basically like giving you that dichotomy between identity or predication,
Yeah,
what would you say to that?
I'm not being rude. We just covered that probably 10 minutes before you got here.
Oh, okay, my fault. Yeah, I just
okay. Before that Protestant dude was in here, we were talking about that, and I went through the Leibsman paper about counting by identity versus counting by division, and the logical problem of the Trinity that Muslims keep putting out. It just hinges on this argument that we count by identity, and we don't. We count by division, and that's why the Church Fathers, when they speak in the Creed, he's one. His nature is undivided, one and undivided amongst the persons. When it says undivided, they're identifying the way that they were counting, which was by division, not by identity. So, for example, it's easy to show this. If I have a piece of paper and the piece of paper is a single piece of paper, if we count by identity, this is one piece of paper, right? Mm-hmm. And it's identified as this whole. But if I do this, it's still that object, right? But if we count by identity, it's no longer the same object. So we can't count by identity now because now there's two objects, you see. So if we identify this equals one and I split it in two, I no longer have the same identity over time, you see. So we don't count by identity, we count by division, especially when it comes to mundane objects like cows or trees or whatever. And in the Creed, they're counting by division, and that's why they use the terminology of undivided. However, the LPT is hinging on the fact that in God, we are counting by identity, and we don't. That's a modern analytical way of counting it. In the ancient world, they count that way, except when they were counting abstract objects like sets or like laws of logic or like Aristotle's categories. So God is not either a mundane object or a purely abstract object. And so if there's differentiation in God, then we might count God in different ways. And so the summary, simple argument response is that different things are counted in different ways. And the argument hinges on everything being counted by identity. And it's not.
And is a false dichotomy because we count in division, not identity. Is that essentially the response?
The argument is premised on that we only count by identity. And in the ancient world, they primarily counted by division, as we do. But they also counted some things by identity, as do we. And some of the things that are counted by identity are things like laws of logic, Aristotle's, because it doesn't make sense to say what's half of an Aristotelian category. There's not. What's half of the law of identity? What's a third of the laws of logic? It doesn't make sense, right?